This is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert, and this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Today we're going to be exploring a fascinating intersection of psychology, economics and demographics through the lens of one of the most insightful thinkers of our time, Morgan Housel. Housel's one of my favourite authors, and he writes about behavioural finance, but he's got a unique ability to distill complex ideas about human behaviour and economics into some simple and powerful insights. So I believe today's show will be fantastic for you, whether you're an investor, a policymaker, or somebody who's just interested in where our world's heading. I hope to give you some fresh perspectives in my discussion with Simon Küstenmacher. Hi, Simon.
Hi, good to be back on.
Now, Simon, again, I'm thrilled at how the audience for our weekly Demographics Decoded podcast has kept growing. People are sharing it, and I guess my message to those who are watching or listening is if you get some benefit from this and you don't currently subscribe, please click the follow or subscribe button on whatever app you're listening to, and also do us a favour and tell somebody else about it. Simon, the audience has grown tremendously, hasn't it?
They have, and I'm very pleased that people really enjoy the idea of learning about the demographic perspective, because that's all we're trying to do here, is to show you one additional perspective through which to interpret the world. And I well and truly believe that if you view the world from a multitude of perspectives, you're capable of making better decisions.
Well, this is now going to be a very different perspective, the perspective of Morgan Housel. I'm going to share with you some of his quotes about money, about progress, about human nature, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it, and I'll give you some of mine as well. But one of the quotes that I love from him is, your personal experience makes up about 0.00001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works.
Yeah, and we well and truly overemphasize our own perspective, don't we? We view the world forever onwards only through our own eyes. And we then overemphasize this. We think, as Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his works, said, what you see is all there is. You think that the whole way that you experience the world is really the full spectrum of reality, whereas it is not. There is much, much more to it. And ideally, we develop throughout school, throughout university, throughout lived experience, and through lifelong reading, a intellectual framework that allows us to understand that we only have a limited perspective, that the world is more complex than our own perception, and that we should not overemphasize our own worldview to begin with.
Well, I find that you see people doing things in my area, particularly with money, and you think, that's crazy. Why are they doing that? But people from different generations, raised by different parents, people who earn different incomes, they hold different values. So there is a demographic slant to this as well. And again, I guess people born in different parts of the world, different economies, experiencing different job markets, they all have different degrees of, we've spoken before about the ovarian lottery, different amount of luck about how they can live in the world of money and finance.
Oh, totally. And you see this in the whole Western world, actually, where there was this big cut with the Second World War that changed things forever. And who had, before the Second World War, before the end of the Second World War, there were, of course, 2 world wars, there was a Great Depression. So this shaped the worldview of a whole generation, who then went on to raise the baby boomers, the biggest birth cohort ever. And so we then go, well, of course, those baby boomers value materialistic belongings much more than other generations, because if you come from nothing, getting something has much more value than when you are the kid of a baby boomer, where you grew up in materialistic riches, where you never wanted for anything, so to speak. And so you lack a certain type of drive, a drive to succeed. That does actually only come naturally if you come from less money. If you come from money, you are operating more from a perspective of comfort, where you understand that ultimately just focusing on money is not everything, but you need to get there first, so to speak. And yeah, and you can multiply this times millions of people, and then you have a generational overlay on this. Yeah, that now the millennials who came from the baby boomer households, that they don't really talked about this. They don't focus on wealth so much. We talked about this last episode where we said that young people these days seek more experiences rather than belongings. And there is a certain cultural logic behind these kinds of behaviors.
Of course, if you come from a different generation, you look at them, and as I said a moment ago, you think, that's crazy. How could they think that? But if you dig deeper, you understand that nobody's crazy. It's just based on what their experiences have been. I think the other point that I've learned over the years reading Morgan Housel's commentary is that we're not rational. We don't make our financial decisions purely with a spreadsheet. They're made at the dinner table or in company meetings where, based on your personal history and your own unique view of the world, your ego, your pride, of course also the marketing that keeps hitting us through social media, and maybe the odd incentive thrown in there as well. So really what we perceive the world to be is just how we see it through our rose-coloured lenses.
Exactly. And in an ideal where you're constantly being able to step back from your own perspective and do not take your own worldview too seriously, but you go, well, that's just my perspective. What do the facts say? You zoom back, you take a step back and try to look at it from the third person, so to speak. You look at yourself from, zoomed out, like you were the actor in a play. And that takes a bit of training, takes a bit of practice, and it's nothing that happens to us intuitively. We need to train ourselves to do this. And then, of course, because it is so hard to do this, ideally you set up a certain system that you then do not constantly need to make decisions. If you have a certain level of routine, a financial routine, the same as with your exercise or diet routine, it's very hard to say no to the cheesecake 12 times a day, but it's very easy to have a routine that says, I'm going for a morning walk, I'm having a certain type of breakfast, whatever it exactly is, then you cleared a certain part of your day in a certain way, and you are not forced to rethink every little action.
I guess when we're making these big decisions, there's also the cognitive biases that we carry that we don't really even know. Hey, Simon, that's going to be a great topic for a future podcast because we are all making decisions with these biases that are hidden that we don't even know about.
Yes, and we need to be aware that there are these biases in us and that we just intuitively throw them out there. And again, ideally, you're constantly doing a bit of self-work as you grow up. You become more self-aware. You increasingly unearth a couple of those biases. You question your entrenched beliefs that you hold, and you wonder, where do those actually come from? Quite often, you realize that there is certain kind of prejudices that you hold, and it doesn't need to be against certain types of people, but just certain ways of living a life are better. I grew up with the absolute belief that owning a house is better than owning an apartment. That house living is better than apartment living. I was like, do I actually believe that? It's just as simple as that, is to constantly question your well and dearly held beliefs.
Okay, let's have another look at one of Morgan Housel's quotes. And he said, the correct lesson to learn from surprises is that the world is surprising. Not that we should use past surprises as a guide to future boundaries, that we should use past surprises as an admission that we've no idea what might happen next. Now, I don't know how you, as a demographer who believes that demography is a crystal ball, and as a futurist, how you accept that quote, Simon.
Yeah, well, so what I do accept is that there is endless surprising stuff happening all the time. My demographic forecasts were always spot on. Except, for example, if you look back 4 years, all of a sudden this pandemic came online that I did not have on the radar. You read about pandemics and so forth. You go like, yeah, that's a thing that could theoretically happen. But it's so big and so odd that you do not put it into your planning. And you couldn't, to be fair. But I think the correct lesson from something like the pandemic is to really understand that rapid change can come. And I think just having lived through a pandemic, and more so, to be honest, for the young people that were in their formative years during the pandemic. So people that were in their teens to 20s in the pandemic, they will forever have this with them. I'm 41, you're a bit older than 41. So we are just past these formative years when the pandemic happened. So it impacted us, but it is not shaping our worldview. And I do think that we really changed our young Gen Zs through the pandemic into a mindset that allows them to be ready for this. Just these kind of things that the quote suggests, that you understand that the world is surprising, that you understand that something could change quite dramatically tomorrow.
Well, another thing on the same topic that Morgan Housel said is history can be a misleading guide to the future of the economy and the stock market, because that's his interest. We think a bit more about property. He says history can be a misleading guide because it doesn't account for structural changes that are relevant in today's world. And we are going through some structural changes, aren't we?
Exactly. So structural changes can be anything from political environments. It can just be a completely different demographic setup in which things occur. And we talk about this in retirement, for example. Retirement, boring, that happened for a long time now. But sometimes there's a structural change and then retirement looks different because now we have a big cohort of people retiring. And all of a sudden, then there is competition for retirement homes. These kind of things. That's a new phenomenon, for example, that we then need to account for when we try to predict what is going to happen. Yes, so always stay on the lookout for what has changed compared to what you benchmark your observations at, because the world keeps changing. And sometimes we forget about this when we just look at, hey, the squiggly line did this in the past, now the squiggly line will do that. It's like, yeah, maybe, but also think about what might have been different since.
Well, along the same lines, Morgan Housel said the most important economic events of the future, things that are going to move the needle the most, are things that history gives us little to no guide about. There'll be unprecedented events. The unprecedented nature means that we won't be prepared for them, which is part of what makes them impactful. Now, I guess this is true of scary events like the pandemic, but also positive events like the great innovations of artificial intelligence.
Exactly. And you hear this all the time. You're probably not even allowed to talk about AI without using the word unprecedented. It's always thrown out there because people scramble for a decent comparison. And so you go like, yeah, different innovations. So you're like internet, the printing press, the steam engine, whatever it was. You try to find analogies to help yourself understand what might be coming. And quite often we overshoot the emphasis of the new technology. So when we look back to what the most creative thinkers said about a new technology, sometimes they overestimated the rate of change. So we must not fall into that pitfall as well.
So the message here is you've got to actually be a student of history, but you've also got to recognise that you're only looking at it in a really small way and you're putting your own biases on it, aren't you, Simon?
Absolutely. And of course, you're looking at this from just your lens. When I look at AI, I'm very much looking at this from the lens of a demographer, where my underlying premise is that we are running out of workers. That's one of the big dangerous things that I see. And so I'm saying, well, AI, that's welcome to me because I can see scenarios where human labor can be substituted with AI. And so then probably the labor shortage won't be as bad as I'm thinking it is if this AI automation thing really takes off. So I view it as a positive. If you view this from a union perspective, for example, AI looks much more scary, much more dangerous. And of course, when you put a particular ethical lens over it, you have yet another perspective. So I understand that, of course, if my job is forecasting, the more perspectives I can soak up, then I get a better narrative together about future events. But yeah, it is challenging because your personal, firmware setting that you use to look at the world, it's hard to overrule sometimes.
On the same topic, Morgan Housel wrote, the further back in history you look, the more general your takeaway should be. General things like people's relations to fear and greed, how they behave under stress, how they respond to incentives. He suggests they're more stable over time compared to the things that keep changing. I guess that's what behavioural finance is all about.
Exactly. And what this says is there is a thing such as human nature. And that has not changed. Doesn't matter whether this is in Roman times, whether this is in modern AI times in the future, or something like this, is certain kind of things that make us human will stay the same. We will be fearful in certain situations. We will be brave and heroic when the opportunities are presented to us. We will be scared to approach, the potential partner at the bar or whatever it is. These things will stay with us. All the while we change a bit, but I do like that, to always come back to the basics of human behavior without, overemphasizing this, of saying, oh, it's all about just our sexual drive or just a fight or flight type of thing that you need to overlay on absolutely everything. It's like, no, but yeah, go back to the basics of what makes us humans.
Another quote I'd like to get your thoughts about from Morgan Housel was his words, long-term planning is harder than it seems because people's goals and desires change over time. I guess what he's saying is underpinning this is that people are poor forecasters of their future selves. Imagining a goal is easy and fun, but imagining a goal in the realistic life stresses, the competitive pursuits that you've got, that's actually much harder to do.
Absolutely true. So the real pressures of actually doing and living through something are much harder. But it's also the idea, if you write a 10-year plan at 20, you do probably not take into account that at 30 you will be a completely different person. If you develop enough, which you should in your 20s, your 30-year-old self better be a completely different person than your 20-year-old self. If not, you failed a bit of personal development tasks, to be honest. So we need to take that into account. We also need to take that into account when we judge people on their past. If you look at somebody in their 40s and they've done some sort of youthful sin or whatever, it's like, whatever. They had 20 years worth of personal development since. Obviously, you take this into account when you judge a character. We cannot behold people on their past sins forever onwards. And I wouldn't even trust myself to forecast just half a year ahead. We're recording this in August. If you asked me at the beginning of the year what my weight would be today, I would have been off. Even though it's completely in my own hands, I would have given you an overly optimistic view of the future. And turns out I would have been wrong in that particular forecast.
Interesting. So I think we should assume that we don't understand what our work requirements are going to be, how long we're going to want to work, how much income we need. The odds that one day you're going to find yourself at some regret if you do that, you've got to be flexible.
Yes, and I think one good shortcut is, do not take your own perspectives too important. Don't emphasize your own importance. Look at statistics. If you go, well, when would I want to retire? That's a difficult question. What do I need in order to be happy in retirement? Who knows what you want? But at least start with anchoring your opinion with the statistical average. Go the average Australian says they want to work until their late 60s. Then you go, well, maybe I shouldn't stray too far off this when I assess my own opinion. When you think what's possible, yes, there are outliers, of course, but take statistical information into consideration and then understand how far off the norm you could stray. And then you are in the most likely, most realistic way of looking at this. I know that a couple of motivational podcasts and whatever the Tony Robbins of this world might disagree with me here, because they say they're just striving to get the absolute peak human potential out of you. And I say, yes, it's possible. But we are not all winning gold medals at the Olympics. Most of us will just be well served with going on a gentle jog once or twice a week, rather than running the marathon at world record time.
I guess you don't really know what the future's going to hold. But as you say, at different stages of your life, what you're looking for is going to be very different. And that actually only came home to me yesterday with a good friend who's also a client who at the age of 78 had to decide, does he buy another investment property or not? And he actually did, but he actually said to me, I'm not sure at my age is it the right decision. What do you think, Michael? And I said, I actually don't think we're going to know for another 10 years. If you, in 10 years' time, are still alive and this great property that you bought has doubled in value and the rent keeps going up, you're going to be really happy you made the decision. Trevor, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're in your mind. What if I'm not around and I die in a year or two's time? Well, you're not going to be around and you won't mind it. Your heirs are going to be happy that you bought a good investment anyway. But a lot of people wouldn't even think of what they're going to need at the age of 78.
Exactly. And it's so far removed from us because quite often we don't have that many people to draw from in our lives that we have a close connection with that can actually guide us into what life will look like, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades into the future. If you are more exposed to the thought, to the ideas of people in their 70s and so forth, then you can actually take those considerations seriously. There are plenty of beautiful books, the 5 concerns of the dying and so forth, where you talk to people that are at the end of life. You go, what do you regret? And if you took those ideas seriously, maybe you could act on them. That'd be cool if you actually were serious about this, but it's a bit hard. And so I understand that as a whole, we're not doing this.
Well, one of the things that drives us is our desire to impress others. However, Morgan Housel said, no one is impressed with your possessions as much as you are. I think the paradox is people tend to want wealth to signal to others that they should be liked, they should be admired. But in reality, those other people, they're probably not as impressed by your car, by your clothes, by your status than you are.
No, and as a general kind of life advice, do things for you, not for others. There is no sense of you don't need to look a certain way, you don't need to behave a certain way to please the rest of the world. I think that's lost. It's lost energy because you have no right to dictate to other people what they think about you. They will form their.
Nor should you care. You shouldn't care because that's only going to upset you too, Simon.
Exactly, and you have no control over it. It's utterly outside of your control what other people think about you. The best you can do is to be kind and generous and ultimately think about as many people as you can. It feels like these advices that I give to my 4-year-old. Be nice, be kind, do good things, and then ultimately this will come back to you. But if you want to impress people with the right sneakers, with the right car, it's the treadmill, the hamster wheel that gets you nowhere. And it's psychologically it's bad. We know there's plenty of psychological research that says if you do things just to impress others, it has negative mental health implications for you. So don't do it. There's whole religions. Buddhism's main idea is just to understand that you are not your obsessions. You're not your possessions. You're not even your thoughts, your feelings. This is all outside of you. There are bigger things than this. And if you completely free yourself from desires, this is where the ultimate happiness is awaiting. Who thought I would give some mini Buddhist lecture here?
Yes. Yeah, I'm impressed with that one. I guess one of the themes coming through Morgan Housel's writings is the subtle recognition that people generally aspire to be respected and admired by others. It's one of the underlying themes that make us buy things. They use money to buy fancy things. But in general, it actually brings you less of what you're desiring than maybe you thought, whether it's the fancy watch or the fancy car or whatever. Of course, if you're enjoying it, if you're doing it for your own satisfaction, I think that's very different, Simon.
It is. And money can solve quite a few problems. There was lots of research out there, and I think this was maybe a decade ago where this really was published. It said I think it was something like $80,000 US, and this is until $80,000 of income, every dollar gives you additional happiness. After this, money does not give you happiness. And that's actually not true. So that number has been pushed away. Money does not make you happy, but money helps you solve problems. So you can always need to look at any kind of problem that you have, and you can go, can I solve this problem by throwing money at it? And so this means, if I have absolutely no time and I want to spend more time with my kids, maybe I can pay somebody who does certain things for me. Maybe they can clean my house. Maybe I can have groceries delivered. That frees up a bit more time in my day. It comes at a financial cost, but I'm willing to do this because then I spend more time with my kids. So I solve the problem by throwing money at it. That is good. But in order to have this option available, you need to have a certain amount of money. These things that I talked about, you need to have a bit of money, not endless money. And of course, the more money you have, the bigger problems you can solve by just throwing money at it.
Well, I used to say any problem that money can solve isn't really a problem, but I've actually fine-tuned that any problem money can solve money that you have can solve isn't really a problem, because you need to have it. So I agree entirely with what you're saying, and it can also help you buy experiences. So I think that it's a story that the poor tell themselves, oh, you don't really need money to make you happy. Money wasn't there to make you happy. Money is really important in those areas of your life where it's important, like paying the school fees and paying the bills and paying the mortgage. And it's not at all important in the other areas of your life where it's not important. And once a year, you join us at Wealth Retreat on the Gold Coast, where we're in a room of already very, very successful business people, entrepreneurs, investors, and they understand that true wealth is much more than money. You need money plus your health. Otherwise, what's the use of the money? Money plus somebody to love and somebody to love you. In my mind, true wealth is money plus growth, the ability to grow, spirituality, the ability to give back to the community. So while we do spend a bit of time talking about money on this podcast and the Michael Yardney podcast, I think we both recognize that true wealth is much more than just how much you have.
Exactly. And it's the boring things is nobody will be impressed at your funeral about your wealth. They talk about the time that you spent with them and maybe your generosity or something like this. So, if you've done the morbid exercise of writing your own obituary, if you've done the plenty of spiritual exercises where you live through your own death, where you live through your own funeral, so to speak, it's very helpful to center you and to understand what ultimately matters. The drive for financial success is wonderful, and it's really cool. And we want people, we want a society, we want an economy that has that, because that ultimately provides collective wealth. And even if you look at this from a purely environmental perspective, for example, you will only start fighting climate change once you achieve a certain level of wealth as an economy. If you become poorer, if you struggle with the basics, then you will not do anything about climate change. In the Ukraine, absolutely no one at the moment is concerned about climate change, because they have bigger fish to fry, so to speak.
Interesting perspective. Now, I've enjoyed working through Morgan Housel's quotes. I've got one last one I'd like to discuss with you, but I also want to remind listeners and viewers that your role at the Demographics Group is to advise businesses, business organisations and government and help them plan for the future, understanding demographics. So if people are interested in getting you to speak to their organisation or their government or their business, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes where they can speak with Fiona and others in your team to have a chat with you about the ability to do that. But the last section I'd like to discuss with you that Morgan Housel has come up with, and I think this was so much fun. I've enjoyed it. We're going to do it again in the future. But his quote was, "Progress happens too slowly to notice. Setbacks happen too quickly to ignore."
Yeah, that's right. That's a lovely. It's a lovely quote, and it's quite often you see this in something silly like a weight loss journey or something like this, because you will not lose weight in one big swoop. You'll lose tiny amounts on a regular basis, and only when you look back for a prolonged period do you see, hey, I'm actually 10 kilos lighter. Pretty cool. Pretty big success. And every now and then, let's say on a weight loss journey, something like an injury knocks you out and you're in hospital, and these things cannot be ignored. And in a, to put the positive spin on it, take any kind of setback that comes, take this as an opportunity to reboot, to reset. And life's journey is full of resets. Life is suffering to a certain degree, and you will constantly be pushed back. And then it's a matter of not being hung up with those setbacks without ignoring them. Taking lessons from them, and then always continue moving on. And considering all those basics that we so often discuss here, that we are operating, we are doing all of this, all of our little life journeys in a rich country in Australia, in a blessed country in many degrees, not perfect, far from it, plenty of challenges, but ultimately you have at least a couple of the basics of life sorted pretty well.
Well, when we think about the demographic perspective of that quote from Morgan Housel, demographics occurs slowly too. The slow ageing of Australia's population might not seem urgent until it suddenly impacts the workforce or social services or healthcare services, Simon.
Absolutely. And again, every now and then we do this just fine. The aging of society that, I, of course, point out to audiences left, right, and center when I'm on stage, because we have this looming aged care crisis coming at us. We managed in the past to not ignore it. In the past, we introduced superannuation in the 80s. This was dreamt up, introduced in the early 90s, because we understood that right now baby boomers would be retired. So we are capable of thinking 3-4 decades into the future. So that's pretty cool. And I do think that we can push, and our podcast does does its small share to do this, that we allow to take on more perspectives when we look at the future and then make smarter decisions.
Well, I think it also has to do with policymakers, governments, businesses. They often react more to the immediate setbacks rather than the long-term trends. But the risk of this short-term focus in planning in Australia in particular is something we've discussed in previous shows, hasn't it?
Yes, and we're forced to look at the short term, and I understand that it's so easy to say our politicians, our leaders, whoever they are, they're meant to tackle our immediate crises. I was like, yes, sure. But I would be very, very pleased if we add a long-term focus. If any kind of policy in Australia would always need to have a little paragraph at the end that says, this is the likely impact of our policy in 5, in 10, in 25, in 100 years. Something like this, so at least forces policy writers to think through the long-term perspective.
Well, Simon, I've enjoyed unpacking Morgan Housel's quotes, and as I said, I think it's something we can discuss again in the future. We're going to be back next week with Demographics Decoded, but if you've been listening to this or watching this and you don't currently subscribe to the show, please, on whichever app you're listening to this, subscribe so you get our content once a week. As well as that, somebody probably told you about it, so why don't you help us share our message by telling somebody else as well? That would do Simon and me a real favour. Simon, I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Fantastic. We'll talk soon.
This Demographics Decoded podcast was brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property and wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. You can follow me on social media, but I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all the social media platforms. I'll include links in the show notes. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Demographics Decoded podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. You'll be doing them a favour. I hope you will anyway, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to shape their future. And of course, any of the discussion we had today was not personal advice about your future, but just general information to help inform.